The morning my father hit me, I had flour on my hands and love in my heart. I remember the way the kitchen smelled, vanilla extract and brown sugar, the scent of something warm being built from scratch. I had woken up at 5:30 in the morning on a Saturday, crept downstairs in my socks, so I wouldn't wake anyone, and started measuring ingredients by the pale blue light above the stove. His favorite cake. 3-layer German chocolate with the coconut pecan frosting he'd been requesting every birthday since I was 7 years old. I was 24 now, back home after 2 years of living in a different city, and I wanted this birthday to feel like a bridge back to something good between us. His name was Raymond Calloway. My father. A man who once carried me on his shoulders through the state fair and told me I could see the whole world from up there. A man who, in recent years, had become someone I hardly recognized when I looked at him across the dinner table. I should tell you something about my family before we go any further, because the slap didn't come from nowhere. Things rarely do. My name is Diana Calloway, and I grew up in a house that looked perfect from the outside, brick colonial 2-car garage, a mother who volunteered at church and a father who coached Little League. But houses like that have basements, and basements have things people don't talk about at Sunday service. I had been back home for 6 weeks at that point, having left my apartment in Charlotte after losing my job in a corporate downsizing. It was supposed to be temporary. A soft landing. My mother, Evelyn, had been thrilled. My father had said, "Sure, fine," in the way he said most things to me, like my existence was a weather event he'd learned to tolerate. The relationship between Raymond Calloway and his only daughter had been fraying for years, one thread at a time. It started when I was 16 and told him I wanted to study literature instead of business. It accelerated when I was 21 and declined to work at his property management company, Calloway Holdings, the business he'd built over 30 years and treated like a second child. The child he actually liked. By the time I was 24 and standing in his kitchen making him a birthday cake, we had developed an entire vocabulary of avoidance. We talked about weather. We talked about sports. We did not talk about the fact that he had quietly removed me from his will 2 years prior and hadn't told me himself. I'd found out from my cousin Adrian at Christmas, her face going white when she realized I didn't know. But that morning, I had decided to try again. That's the thing about daughters and their fathers. We keep trying long after we should have stopped. We keep baking the cake. I heard him on the stairs at 8:15. The heavy, deliberate footstep that always announced him like a drumbeat. I had the cake on the counter, 3 layers already frosted, with "Happy Birthday, Dad" written carefully across the top in the looping cursive he'd helped me practice when I was 8. I had a mug of his coffee ready, black, no sugar, 1 scoop of grounds more than the instructions recommended, because he said anything weaker tasted like regret. "Morning," I said, turning with a smile that I'd been rehearsing since 5:30. He stopped in the doorway of the kitchen and looked at the cake. He looked at the coffee. He looked at me. And something moved across his face that I couldn't quite read. Something complicated, like a man who has just found a letter he wished had stayed lost. "Your mother told you to do this," he said. "She didn't," I said. "I wanted to." He made a sound in the back of his throat. He walked to the coffee pot and poured himself a cup, ignoring the one I'd already made him. A small thing. But I'd learned to read the small things. "The Henderson file is on the desk in my office," he said, his back to me. "I noticed someone moved it." I blinked. "I haven't been in your office. I'm not accusing you." But the way he said it meant he was. The morning continued like that, a series of small cold fronts passing through the kitchen. My mother came down at 9, kissed his cheek, exclaimed over the cake. My Aunt Patricia arrived at noon with my cousins, and by 2 in the afternoon, the house was full of people eating off paper plates and laughing too loud at Raymond's jokes, because that was the social contract in our family. You laughed at his jokes. You complimented his grilling. You made him feel like the tallest person in any room he occupied. I had been doing fine. I had been keeping my distance, circling the periphery of the party the way you circle a dog you're not sure about. But then my father started talking about Calloway Holdings in the way he always did when he'd had a few beers. Expansively, grandly, as if narrating his own documentary. "The Meridian Street project is going to change everything," he was telling my Uncle Darnell. 48 units. Mixed income. I've got investors lined up from here to Atlanta. I was refilling the ice in the cooler nearby, not intending to be part of the conversation. But something made me ask, I still don't know why. Maybe it was the 6 weeks of tension. Maybe it was the 5:30 wake-up and the 3-layer cake he hadn't thanked me for. Maybe it was just that I was 24 and tired of pretending not to notice the things I noticed. Isn't that the lot on Meridian that's been in the Whitfield family for 60 years? I said. I read something in the local paper about a dispute. Raymond turned and looked at me the way a storm front turns. You read the local paper now, he said. It wasn't a question. I was just asking, I said. I didn't mean. You didn't mean, he repeated. You never mean. You just open your mouth and let whatever falls out land wherever it lands. The people nearby went quiet. My mother took a small step toward us, then stopped. Dad, I said carefully. I'm sorry. It was just a question. Just a question, he said, and he set his beer down on the cooler next to me with a hard crack of glass on plastic. You've been back in this house for 6 weeks doing nothing, contributing nothing, and you want to stand there and ask questions about my business in front of my family? The words hit like a door slamming. I felt the redness start at my neck. I made you a birthday cake, I said, and I know how small that sounds, but it was the only thing I had. I didn't ask for a birthday cake, he said. I asked for some respect. And then, before I understood what was happening, before the moment organized itself into something I could prepare for, his hand came up. Open palm. The sound of it was flat and sharp, like a book dropped on a hard floor. My right cheek. My ear rang. The backyard went so quiet I could hear the neighbors' wind chimes 3 houses down. I didn't cry. That is the one thing I need you to know. I did not cry. I pressed my hand to my cheek, looked at my father, who already looked slightly stunned at himself, his hand hanging in the air between us, and I walked inside the house, through the kitchen, past the 3-layer German chocolate cake, and up to my room. I sat on my bed with my hand on my cheek, and stared at the wall. And that was when I noticed something. On the floor near the air vent, half tucked under the baseboard as if it had slipped from somewhere and been forgotten, was a piece of folded paper. I picked it up. It had my father's handwriting on the outside, and a name I didn't recognize. I unfolded it. I read 4 sentences before I had to stop and read them again. Whatever I had thought this day was about, a slap, a birthday, a ruined afternoon, I had been completely wrong. This was about something much, much bigger. You have to understand what it means to find something you weren't supposed to find. There's a specific kind of stillness that comes over you. Your body goes very quiet, like an animal that has sensed something in the brush. Every sound in the house, my father's voice drifting up through the floor, the laughter restarting in the backyard, my mother calling someone's name, all of it recedes into a distant frequency, and there is only the paper in your hands and the words on it and the slow, terrible process of understanding what they mean. The note was dated 3 weeks prior. It was addressed to someone named L. Weston, with a street address I didn't immediately recognize. My father's handwriting, the same careful print he'd used to label my school folders when I was little, filled about half the page. I will not reproduce every word here, because some of it was in financial shorthand I had to decode later. But the core of what it said was this. Raymond Calloway was asking L. Weston to falsify an environmental assessment for the Meridian Street property. He was asking this person to sign off on a clean report for a parcel of land that Raymond apparently knew had soil contamination from a dry cleaning operation that had occupied the site in the 1980s. And he was offering, in exchange, a $10,000 cash payment and the ongoing arrangement we've discussed. I read it 4 times. The Meridian Street project was 48 residential units. Mixed-income housing. Meaning families. Meaning children. Meaning people who trusted that the building they were moving into had been built on ground that wouldn't make them sick. I sat on my bed for a very long time. I want to be careful here because I know how this must look from the outside. A daughter who's been slapped, who's angry, who finds a piece of paper and decides to use it. I need you to know that the 2 things were happening in separate rooms of my mind. The sting on my cheek and the paper in my hand were not in the same conversation yet. What I felt in that moment, reading his words, was not revenge. It was grief. Because the man who had just humiliated me in front of his entire family was the same man who might be about to poison other people's families. And I was his daughter. And the cake was still downstairs. I took a photo of the note with my phone. Then I folded it and placed it back exactly where I had found it, near the vent, half under the baseboard. I didn't know yet what I was going to do. But I knew I needed time to think, and I knew I needed information, and I knew I could not let my father see my face until I had both of those things. The party wrapped up around 7. I stayed in my room, claiming a headache. My mother knocked twice and I told her I was fine. The second time she knocked, she didn't say anything, just let her hand rest against the door for a moment before she walked away, and that gesture told me everything about how she moved through this family, pressing her palm against closed doors and hoping for the best. My cousin Adrian texted me at 8:15. "Are you okay?" That was insane. He needs help. I didn't respond. I was on my laptop, opening a new browser window. I started with the Meridian Street property address. It didn't take long, local county records were public, and the parcel had a history that spanned decades. The dry cleaning facility my father had referenced was real. It had operated there from 1971 to 1989 under a company called Prestige Cleaners. In 1991, a county environmental survey had flagged the site for potential perchloroethylene contamination, a chemical dry cleaners used that was a known carcinogen, a known groundwater contaminant, and a known destroyer of the health of people who lived near it for extended periods. The site had changed hands 3 times since then. There had been 2 environmental assessments, both inconclusive, both done cheaply by firms that no longer existed. Raymond had purchased the vacant lot 14 months ago. I found L. Weston in about 20 minutes. Lawrence Weston, a certified environmental engineer with a small consulting firm called Weston Environmental Solutions, based in our city, with a state certification number, a LinkedIn profile, and 3 Google reviews, 2 of which were 5 stars and 1 of which said cryptically, "Not what I expected. Wouldn't use again." I wrote down his certification number. I wrote down the address from the note. I wrote down everything. Then I sat back and asked myself the hardest question of the night. Not what to do with what I knew, but who else already knew it. Because here is the thing about a man like Raymond Calloway. He had been building this company for 30 years. He was organized. He was careful. And if he was doing what that note suggested, he had likely been doing variations of it for a long time. The Meridian Street project was just the one I'd stumbled into. It was unlikely to be the only one. I thought about my cousin Adrian, who worked in the accounting department of Calloway Holdings. I thought about the look on her face at Christmas when she mentioned the will. I thought about how she'd texted me tonight not just with shock, but with something that felt like relief, as if she'd been waiting for a crack in the wall. I almost called her. I picked up my phone twice. The second time, I had her name on the screen and my thumb over the call button. I put the phone down, because something told me that whoever I brought into this next needed to be chosen very carefully. One wrong person and the note would disappear, the ground would be paved over, and 48 families would move into contaminated housing without ever knowing what had been done to them. I lay back on my childhood bed and looked at the ceiling, at the faint ghostly rectangles where my old posters had been. And I made a decision that I knew would change every relationship in my life. I just didn't know yet that it would also uncover the second secret, the one that wasn't about the land at all, the one that was about me. I left the house at 7 the next morning before anyone was awake. There was a coffee shop 6 blocks away called Perch, a small place with mismatched chairs and a chalkboard menu, and I sat at a corner table with a legal pad and wrote out everything I knew in the careful, organized way my father had taught me, ironically, when I was 12. "If it's not on paper, it didn't happen," he used to say. He used to say a lot of things that now felt like instructions for his own undoing. I wrote down the note. I wrote down what I knew about the property. I wrote down Lawrence Weston's credentials and the address. I wrote down the timeline, when Raymond bought the lot, when the previous assessments were done, when the Meridian Street project had been publicly announced. The announcement had been covered in the local business journal 4 months ago, with a quote from my father. "This is about building something that lasts. Something for this community." I underlined that quote twice, and not with admiration. I had been sitting there for about 40 minutes when the bell above the door rang, and a woman walked in who I had never seen before. She was maybe 50, slim, with natural gray locks pulled back and reading glasses pushed up on her head, carrying a large green accordion folder under one arm and a dripping umbrella in her hand because it had started raining outside while I wasn't paying attention. She ordered at the counter, turned with her cup, scanned the cafe, and caught my eye. People scan for seats and look away. She did not look away. She walked directly toward my table with the focused efficiency of someone who had somewhere to be and had decided that somewhere was here. "You look like you're working something out," she said, glancing at my legal pad without reading it, a studied in curiosity that itself felt like a skill. "Mind if I sit? The other tables wobble." "Go ahead," I said. Her name, she told me in the offhand way people mention weather, was Paulette Okafor. She said it like she was used to people recognizing it, and I didn't. And then she said she was a housing rights attorney, and something in my chest went very still. What kind of housing? I asked. The kind where developers cut corners and poor people end up breathing asbestos, she said, opening her green folder with the ease of someone who had that conversation often. I've got a case I'm prepping today. Site contamination issue on the east side. I looked at her. Meridian Street? I said. The way she looked up from her folder, slowly, 1 degree at a time, like a camera finding focus, told me everything. Who are you? She said. I told her my name. I watched her process it. I watched her connect Calloway to Calloway Holdings the way you watch someone turn a key in a lock. You're Raymond Calloway's daughter, she said. Yes, I said. And I have a photograph of a note you're going to want to see. What happened in the next 2 hours in that coffee shop, with the rain coming down outside and my legal pad between us, was the kind of conversation that reorganizes the geography of your life. Paulette Okafor had been investigating the Meridian Street project for 8 weeks. She had a client, a woman named Bernice, 72, whose family had owned a barbershop on that block for 40 years and who had received a buyout offer from Calloway Holdings that felt, as Bernice had put it, like they were paying me to look the other way. Paulette had started pulling the environmental thread and found the same history I had found, but with more depth, more documentation, and a suspicion she hadn't been able to prove yet. That the environmental assessment my father had submitted with his construction permit application was fraudulent. She had Lawrence Weston's name. She had a clean report he'd filed. She had not had the note. I showed her the photograph. She read it once. She put down her coffee. She read it again. Can you get me the original? She said. Maybe, I said. I need to think about how. Take your time, she said, in a tone that meant please don't take your time. I asked her what would happen next. She told me carefully and honestly. A complaint to the State Environmental Agency. A potential referral to the District Attorney's Office for fraud, civil liability for any harm caused to people who purchased or occupied the units. She said words like injunction and discovery and restitution. She said them the way doctors say words like malignant, with a gentleness that doesn't hide the weight. He could lose everything, I said. Not a question. If it goes the way the evidence suggests, she said. Yes. The company. The assets. Potentially his liberty, depending on what else is there. I drove home in the rain and sat in my car in the driveway for 11 minutes without going inside. When I finally went in, my father was in the kitchen eating toast and reading the paper, perfectly ordinary, perfectly calm. He looked up when I walked in. Diana, he said. The first word he'd spoken to me since the slap. Good morning, I said. I was thinking we should talk about yesterday. I poured myself a glass of water at the sink. My back was to him. Sure, I said. I was out of line, he said. I waited for the next sentence. The one that would explain or justify or soften. The one that would be the real point. I've been under a lot of pressure with the Meridian project, he said. It's not an excuse. No, I said quietly. It's not. I turned around and looked at my father across the kitchen, and in that moment I understood something that no child wants to understand. The man standing there offering a half apology had no idea that the thing consuming him was already unraveling. He thought he was managing it. He thought he was in control. He was not in control. And the note was still near the vent upstairs. I needed to get it before he did. Which meant I had maybe 48 hours to make the most consequential decision of my life. What I didn't know yet was that Adrienne had already made a decision of her own, and what she'd done 3 days ago, before the birthday party, before the slap, before any of this, had already set something in motion that none of us could stop. Here is the thing about secrets in a family. They don't stay in one place. They move. They spread through walls and phone calls and guilty expressions at holiday dinners. They get whispered between cousins in the back seats of cars when the adults think they're asleep. They get written in notes that fall near vents. They get carried around in the hearts of people who don't know yet that they're carrying them. Adrienne Calloway, my father's niece, my first cousin, 27 years old with a finance degree and a conscience that had been troubling her for months, had worked at Calloway Holdings for 3 years. She ran accounts payable. She processed invoices. And 6 months ago, she had started noticing something in the numbers that made her throat go dry every time she sat down at her desk. Vendor payments to a company called Greenway Consulting Solutions. Regular. Quarterly. Amounts just under the threshold that would trigger automatic review. Totaling over 18 months, roughly $90,000. Adrienne had looked up Greenway Consulting Solutions. It had a website, Sparse, professional, vague. It listed no employees, no physical address, just a P.O. box and a contact form. It listed its services as environmental compliance consulting. She had searched for any project documents that referenced Greenway's work. There were none. She had searched for contracts. There were none. She had mentioned it to my father's office manager, Terrence, in what she thought was a casual way, and Terrence had gone very quiet, and then said, "I'd leave that one alone, Adrian," with an expression she'd described to me as the look someone makes when they've already decided not to know something. So Adrian had sat on it. For months. Eating lunch at her desk, and looking at those quarterly payments, and not sleeping well, and telling herself it wasn't her place. And then, 3 days before my father's birthday, she had made a call. Not to me. She hadn't wanted to involve me. She had called the state contractor licensing board anonymously. She had described the payments, described the vendor, described the absence of documentation. She had given them enough to open an inquiry. She had hung up without giving her name. She told me all of this on Monday morning, 2 days after the party, sitting across from me at Perch. The same coffee shop, different table, different weather, the same feeling of a floor shifting underfoot. "I didn't know you'd come back home," she said. "I didn't know any of this other stuff about the environmental thing. I just knew the money wasn't right." "Greenway Consulting Solutions," I said slowly. "Do you think that's related to Lawrence Weston?" Adrian pulled out her phone and showed me a screenshot she'd taken of the Greenway website. And there, in the site's footer, in small gray text that you'd only see if you were looking, a division of Weston Environmental Solutions. We looked at each other across the table. "He was paying for the fraud," I said. "Not just asking for it. He'd built an entire payment structure around it." "And there's more," Adrian said. She set her phone face down on the table in the deliberate way people do when they're about to say something they've been carrying too long. 3 months ago, I found a second set of books. Not on the main server. On a personal drive that was accidentally routed through the shared network during an IT update. I copied what I could before it rerouted. "Adrian." "I know," she said. "What was in it?" She told me about the second set of books. Payments to entities I didn't recognize. Revenue from properties that didn't appear in the official portfolio. The outline of what looked like a parallel operation, smaller, older, predating Calloway Holdings as a formal company. Transactions going back 15 years. I thought about the 48 units on Meridian Street, and I thought about those 15 years, and I felt the shape of something enormous moving just beneath the surface of what I could see. "We need to go to Paulette," I said. "Who's Paulette?" I had started to explain when my phone buzzed. A text from a number I didn't recognize. "Diana, we need to talk. I know what you found in the house. I know what you're thinking about doing. Please, before you do anything, call me Elle." I stared at the text. L. Weston. Lawrence Weston knew I had the note, which meant one of two things. Either my father had discovered the note was gone or moved and had told Weston, or Weston himself had been in my family's house. Either possibility meant we had less time than I thought. I showed the text to Adrian. Her face went the color of old paper. "Diana," she said, "there's one more thing I haven't told you yet. Something I found in those files that isn't about the money." She paused. Her jaw was tight. "It's about you," she said. "About why your dad really took you out of the will." The coffee shop sounds rushed back and around me. The grinder, the music, someone's child laughing near the window. "Tell me," I said. And she did. "If you're still watching right now, you're exactly the kind of viewer I love. Subscribe so I can keep giving you stories that touch your heart. Hit that bell so you never miss what happens next." It had been there in the files like a stone in a garden. Ordinary looking. Easy to step over. Until you understood what it was holding down. What Adrian had found, buried in the documents on that accidentally shared drive, was a letter. Not a legal document, a personal letter typed and signed addressed to my father. It was dated 4.5 years ago. Before I'd moved to Charlotte. Before the will change. Before the silence between us had calcified into something structural. The letter was from a man named Gerald Moss. The name meant nothing to me when Adrian said it. But then she said, "He was your father's business partner. The original one. From before Calloway Holdings was officially incorporated." I remembered then. A photograph in a box in the attic. My father and another man in front of a building, young, grinning, hard hats, handshake. My mother had told me once that the partner had left the business over creative differences, when I was about 3. "Gerald Moss sent your father a letter 4.5 years ago," Adrian said. She had the relevant section photographed on her phone, She turned the screen toward me. He was dying. Liver cancer. He wrote to your father about clearing his conscience. I read the section she'd indicated. Gerald Moss had written, I am paraphrasing now, because the words were his and I will not reproduce them, that he had spent years unable to forgive himself for what he had allowed to happen in the early days of the partnership. He wrote that he had kept silent because he was afraid, and because Raymond had made clear what the consequences of speaking would be. He wrote that he wanted Raymond to know that the silence would end with him, that he had made arrangements to ensure it did. And then he wrote something that made me put Adrienne's phone down on the table and press both my palms flat against the surface. Gerald Moss wrote that he had documentation proving that Raymond Calloway had misappropriated funds belonging to a third partner in the original business, a silent investor who had put in $50,000 in the mid-1990s and who had never been paid a return, never been acknowledged, and who had died in 2003 never knowing what had happened to their investment. Gerald wrote the name of that original silent investor. The name was Eleanor Whitmore Calloway, my grandmother, my father's mother. Raymond Calloway had stolen from his own mother, had built the first foundation of his business empire on money that belonged to her, that she had trusted him with, that she had given him as an investment because she believed in him, and he had rerouted it through the partnership structure, paid Gerald Moss to stay quiet, and told his mother that the investment had simply not performed. My grandmother had died in 2003. She had died believing she'd made a bad investment. She had left behind very little, her savings depleted, her later years financially constrained, because $50,000 in the mid-90s, properly invested and returned, would have been worth significantly more by the time she died. But what does this have to do with the will? I said. My voice was flat. I was somewhere past the range where normal emotional reactions live. Adrienne looked at me with the expression of someone delivering the final weight to an already burdened scale. When Gerald Moss sent that letter, she said, your father apparently panicked. He hired someone to go through Gerald's affairs. I found a payment in the files to an investigative consultant, trying to locate whatever documentation Gerald claimed to have. The consultant's report said the documentation had likely been given to someone for safekeeping. Someone Gerald trusted. Okay, I said. The consultant's report named 3 possibilities. 2 of them were old business associates. The third one, Adrienne stopped. She put her hand over mine. The third one was you, Diana. Gerald Moss had been in contact with you. You and he had exchanged emails when you were doing that oral history project in college. I sat very still. When I was 20, I had taken a course on community memory and local business history. My professor had encouraged us to interview older members of the business community. I had interviewed Gerald Moss over email, 3 or 4 exchanges, perfectly innocent, about the early days of Charlotte's commercial real estate sector. He had been kind and forthcoming, and I had thanked him in my project acknowledgments. I had thought nothing of it. My father had seen the consultant's report. He had seen my name, and 2 months after receiving that report, Raymond Calloway had changed his will, removing his only daughter as a beneficiary because he believed, incorrectly as it happened, that Gerald Moss had given me the documentation, that I was holding it, that I was a threat. He hadn't pulled me from his will because of the literature degree or the career choice, or the way I asked questions at his birthday party. He had pulled me from his will because he was afraid of me, because he thought I already knew. I walked out of the coffee shop and stood on the sidewalk in the thin February air and called Paulette Okafor. I need to see you today, I said when she answered. All of it is connected, and it goes back further than either of us realized. There was a brief silence. How much further? She asked. Almost 30 years, I said. Another silence. Then, I'll cancel my afternoon. I turned to go back inside to get Adrienne, and that's when I saw the car. Dark gray sedan, parked across the street, engine running. And in the driver's seat, the dim shape of a man looking directly at me. He lifted his phone and took a photo. I memorized the license plate number in the way you do when your body understands danger before your mind catches up. 7 characters. I typed them into my phone as I pushed back through the coffee shop door, grabbed Adrienne's arm, and said, "We need to leave out the back." "What? Why?" "There's a man outside who just photographed me. I don't know who sent him, but I have a strong suspicion." Adrienne had worked for Raymond Calloway for 3 years. She knew enough not to ask more questions right then. We left through the service exit, past a startled barista and a stack of cardboard boxes, into the alley behind the building. We split up, her to her car 2 streets over, me in the opposite direction on foot. I called Paulette while I was walking. She told me to come to her office. She told me to take a cab, not an Uber, and to pay cash. She told me these things with the calm efficiency of a woman who had dealt with intimidation tactics before, who had learned through experience what pressure from powerful people looked like, and how to move through it without breaking stride. Paulette's office was on the 4th floor of a building downtown, small and dense with filing cabinets and stacked depositions, and the smell of work being done over many years. She had a partner, a younger man named Diana, who was apparently brilliant at forensic financial analysis, and who shook my hand and immediately began examining everything Adrian had sent over on his laptop without saying more than 4 words total. I told Paulette everything. The note, Lawrence Weston's text message, Gerald Moss's letter, my grandmother, the second set of books, the gray sedan. I laid it all out in order, the way I'd written it on my legal pad, and Paulette listened with her reading glasses on and her hands folded and her expression changing so slowly you could barely track it. When I finished, there was a silence. Okay, Paulette said. Okay, I said. The environmental fraud piece, the Weston note, the fraudulent assessment, the Greenway payments, that's the most actionable right now. That's where the clearest harm is, and the clearest documentation is. I can file a complaint with the state environmental agency today, and I can simultaneously notify the district attorney's office, which I already have a contact in. What about the grandmother? The original investor fraud. That's civil, and complicated by time. Gerald Moss is dead. The original documentation he referenced is still unlocated, unless it turns up, but it provides a pattern. It speaks to intent and character in ways that matter. She paused. The will thing. That's actually something you might have a separate cause of action on, if we can demonstrate he removed you based on a false belief that you were a threat to him. Undue disinheritance based on retaliation for a non-existent threat. I don't care about the will, I said. Paulette looked at me over her glasses. Diana, she said carefully. I need to ask you something and I need you to answer it honestly. Go ahead. Are you doing this because of the slap? Because of the anger? I need to know because if this goes the way I think it's going to go, there will be a moment, probably more than one, where you will have the option to stop it. To pull back. To protect your family name and accept a settlement and walk away. And I need to know if you're strong enough not to take that option. Because the people who matter most in this case are 48 families who don't know they're about to be poisoned. I thought about my grandmother. I thought about her last years, financially constrained, believing her investment had failed. I thought about the letter, and how Raymond had built his empire and coached Little League and grilled at birthday parties on the foundation of what he had taken from her. This isn't about the slap, I said. The slap just showed me who he actually was when he thought no one important was watching. Paulette held my gaze for a long moment. Then she nodded once, picked up her phone, and began to make calls. While she was on the phone, Diana turned his laptop around to show me something. He had cross-referenced the Greenway payment records with the county permitting database and found 3 other projects. Not just Meridian Street, where Calloway Holdings had used Weston Environmental Solutions and where the subsequent environmental clearances had come back unusually clean. 3 other sites. 3 other sets of families. I stared at the screen and felt the number land in my chest like something physical. 3 other sites. Going back 11 years. Lawrence Weston's text earlier that day suddenly felt less like a warning and more like a desperate man reaching for a life preserver before a ship went down. And ships, I was learning, could take a great deal down with them when they sank. My phone buzzed. Adrian. He knows. He called me into his office. He asked me directly if I'd been talking to you. I told him we'd had coffee. He went pale, like actually pale. He just asked me to pull all the Greenway files. I typed back, do not pull those files. Go home sick. Do it now. 3 seconds passed. Done. Already in my car. Diana, I'm scared. I know, I wrote back. So is he. That's actually the good news. I looked up at Paulette, who had just ended a call, and said, how fast can this move? She said, faster than he's expecting. What neither of us knew at that moment was that Raymond Calloway had not been sitting still. While I had been in this office, while Adrian had been driving home, my father had been on the phone with someone. Not Lawrence Weston, not Terrence, not any of his usual advisors. He had been on the phone with my mother. And what he told her, what he asked her to do, was something Evelyn Calloway would later describe to a judge as the moment she knew her marriage was over. My mother had been beautiful when she was young. Not in the conventional way, not in the way that made rooms go quiet, but in the way that makes people trust you. Open face, easy smile, the particular kind of warmth that comes from a person who genuinely wants good things for everyone she meets. Evelyn Calloway had wanted good things. She had wanted them badly enough to spend 31 years married to a man who had slowly, methodically, taught her that wanting was something you learned to keep quiet. She told me all of this later. After. When there was enough distance between then and now for her to speak plainly, which is something she had rarely been able to do inside the life she'd been living. When Raymond called her that Monday afternoon, while I was in Paulette's office while Adrian was driving home, he told Evelyn that Diana had found something she wasn't supposed to find. He did not tell her what it was. He said it was a private business matter, and that Diana was unstable and acting out of anger because of what had happened at the party. He asked Evelyn to call me. He asked her to tell me to come home. He asked her to get my phone away from me, to keep you safe, in case Diana says something that could be misinterpreted. My mother had listened to this request on the phone. She had said, "All right, Raymond." She had hung up. And then she had done something she had never done in 31 years of marriage. She called a lawyer. Not Paulette, she didn't know about Paulette yet. She called a family friend, a woman named Diana Sellers who did estate planning and family law, and who had once, at a dinner party 6 years ago, looked at Evelyn across a table and said quietly, "You know my number. You can always call me." My mother had remembered that. Had kept it. Had carried it for 6 years like a folded piece of paper near a vent. She told Diane everything she knew. Which was less than what I knew, but more than anyone had given her credit for. She knew about the Greenway payments. She had seen a bank statement once and asked Raymond about a large quarterly transfer, and he had dismissed it as accounting overhead. She knew that Raymond had changed my name out of the will, and she knew the reason he'd given her had never quite made sense. She knew about the Henderson file that Raymond had mentioned the morning of his birthday, the file he'd accused me of moving, and she knew because she had a habit of noticing small things in a household run by a man who didn't expect to be watched, that file had been moved not by me, but by Raymond himself, 2 days before the party, to a place she had noted carefully. She told Diane where the file was. Diana Sellers told her to stay calm, to stay in the house, to not confront Raymond, and to write down everything she could remember about every financial anomaly she'd ever noticed, and then photograph those notes and send them to Diane's secure email. My mother spent the next 3 hours at the kitchen table. The same table where Raymond ate toast and read the paper, writing 4 pages of notes. Dates. Amounts. Names. Things overheard. Things dismissed. Things she had quietly, methodically, committed to memory over 31 years without ever quite admitting to herself why she was keeping score. She told me later that it was the most clear-headed she had felt in decades. I found out about all of this when I finally got home at 8 o'clock that evening. Raymond's car was gone. He was at the Calloway Holdings office, which he didn't tell anyone but which I assumed from the empty driveway. My mother was at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, and the particular stillness of a person who has just made a large, irreversible decision. She looked up when I came in. "Sit down, Diana," she said. I sat. She told me what she'd done. She told me about Diana Sellers. She told me about the notes. She slid a copy across the table to me. She had printed 2. I read through the 4 pages. Twice. Then I looked at my mother, this woman I had sometimes underestimated, this woman who had pressed her palm against my door and not said anything, and I said, "Mom, how long have you known?" "I haven't known," she said quietly. "I've suspected. There's a difference." She wrapped both hands around her tea. I told myself the difference mattered. "It did matter," I said. "Until it didn't." She nodded. Her eyes were dry. Her hands were steady. "What happens now?" she asked. I told her about Paulette. I told her about the state complaint being filed. I told her about the district attorney contact. I told her that it was moving faster than Raymond anticipated, and that we needed to be careful, and that she should not go to the office, and should not destroy anything, and should not speak to Raymond about any of it. She listened with the focused attention of a woman who had been spoken over for so long that the experience of being given real information felt almost physical. "There's one more thing," she said when I'd finished. She stood up, went to the cabinet above the refrigerator, the one we used for extra napkins and birthday candles and the small miscellany of a family, and reached to the very back. She set something on the table in front of me. It was a manila envelope. Old. The clasp had been opened and reclosed many times. My mother's handwriting on the front, in pencil, GM documents. "Do not discard." I looked at her. Gerald Moss sent those to me, she said. 4.5 years ago. He said I was the safest person to hold them because Raymond would never suspect I'd done anything with them. I don't know how he knew that about our marriage. She paused. Actually, I do know. You kept them, I said. I kept them, she said. Because I didn't know what to do with them. Because I was afraid. Because I told myself I was protecting the family. She looked at the envelope. I was protecting him. It's not the same thing. The envelope contained 15 pages. Original financial records from the early partnership. Gerald Moss's contemporaneous notes. A timeline. A signed statement from Gerald acknowledging his own role, and attesting to Raymond's. The documentation Gerald Moss had promised was in existence. It had been above the refrigerator the whole time. I called Paulette at 8:45. She was still at her office. She said 3 words when I told her what we had. Bring it tomorrow. I lay awake that night listening to the house settle around me, this brick colonial that had looked perfect from the outside, and I thought about all the things held inside it. The note near the vent. The file in the cabinet. The envelope above the refrigerator. The 4 pages of notes my mother had written at the kitchen table. I thought about how much truth a house can hold. I thought about Raymond driving back to this house in the dark, walking through the front door, eating something from the refrigerator, going to sleep next to my mother, having no idea what was waiting for him in a manila envelope 2 feet above his head. And then I heard his car in the driveway. And I heard the front door open. And I heard my mother's voice downstairs, steady as I had ever heard it, say, Raymond, we need to talk. I pressed my ear to the floor. I want to be careful about what I tell you here, because I was 1 floor up and I could not hear every word. I am going to tell you what I could make out, and what my mother told me afterward, and try to be honest about the difference. What I heard clearly, my mother's voice, even and deliberate. My father's voice, which started low and defensive and escalated in the way I had learned to read as a child. The second register, the clipped consonants, the syllables that fell like hammers. What I heard him say, clearly enough that I have never forgotten it. You have no idea what you're talking about, Evelyn. What I heard her say. I have every idea. I have 15 pages of ideas. A silence then, long enough that I pressed harder against the floor. What my mother told me afterward, filling in the rest. Raymond had gone still when she mentioned the documents. She said it was like watching a man who had been moving very fast suddenly understand that the ground ahead of him wasn't there. She said he sat down, which he rarely did when he was upset, because sitting felt to him like conceding territory. He sat down and he looked at the envelope on the table, and he asked her where she got it. She told him. She told him about Gerald Moss's letter, and the package that had arrived 4.5 years ago, and the cabinet above the refrigerator. Raymond had said, You've had it all this time. Yes, she'd said. And you kept it. Yes. Why didn't you? He'd stopped. He'd started again. Why didn't you say something? Why didn't you come to me? We could have what, Raymond? Another silence. I kept it, my mother told me she'd said. Because I didn't know what to do, and because I was afraid, and because there were years I told myself I must be misunderstanding it. But mostly I kept it because some part of me knew that one day, if I was patient enough, the right moment would come. And I have been patient for a very long time. I heard my father's voice rise after that. I heard words I will not repeat. I heard my mother's voice stay level. And I heard something I had never heard before in my parents' house. The specific quality of a silence in which a man realizes he is the least powerful person in a room. He came upstairs at some point. I lay in my bed and listened to him stop outside my door. He stood there for a moment. I held my breath. He did not knock. He went to the bedroom. I heard the door close. I did not sleep that night. I lay in the dark and thought about what morning would look like. Morning arrived in the ordinary way, indifferent to the human dramas playing out beneath it. Sun coming through the curtains, birds making their ordinary demands, the neighbor's sprinkler system clicking on at 6:15. My father's car was gone when I came downstairs. My mother was at the kitchen table again, with coffee this time, and the manila envelope was gone. He took it, I said, alarmed. No, she said. She tapped her phone. Photographed every page last night before he came home. Everything is with Diane. I exhaled. He went to the office, she said. He called Terrence. I heard him on the phone in the bedroom at 5:30. She sipped her coffee. He's trying to manage it. He can't manage this, I said. I know, she said. He doesn't know that yet. I called Paulette at 7:30. She had filed the environmental complaint the previous evening. She had heard from her contact at the district attorney's office. There was interest. There was urgency. There was, she told me, something she hadn't expected. Another complainant had already come forward 2 weeks ago, and the DA's office had been quietly building a case around the Meridian Street project before we ever arrived. Who? I said. Lawrence Weston, Paulette said. I stopped walking. Weston turned himself in? 2 weeks ago, she said. He cooperated. He gave them documents, recorded calls, the works. He was the DA's informant. That text he sent you the day you were here with Adrian. He wasn't threatening you. He was trying to warn you that things were already moving. The text message. I know what you're thinking about doing. Please, before you do anything, call me. He had been trying to stop me from doing something that would interfere with an active investigation. He had been trying to protect a case that was already built, already loaded, already pointed at my father's business like a structure waiting for the first breath of wind. How long? I asked. The DA is moving for an injunction on the construction permit today, Paulette said. And a warrant for business records. Which means it all becomes public. Yes, she said. Diana, it's going to move very fast from here. Are you and your mother somewhere safe? We're home, I said. You might want to be somewhere else today, she said. When the warrant is served, Raymond will know everything. And some people, when the walls come in, they go home. I looked at my mother across the kitchen. She had her hands around her coffee cup and her eyes on the window, watching the ordinary morning happen outside. Mom, I said. Pack a bag. She put down her coffee. She nodded once. She stood up. She did not ask why, which told me everything about how thoroughly she had already made her peace with this. We were in the car with 2 bags and the dog before 8 o'clock. I drove to Adrienne's apartment. We sat in Adrienne's living room with the local news on low, and at 11:47 in the morning, the local news ticker updated. Calloway Holdings CEO subject of fraud investigation. Construction permit suspended. My mother watched the ticker scroll. Her face was completely still. Then she said, quietly and without any particular drama, I should call my sister. She stood up and walked to the back of the apartment to make her call, and through the wall I could hear her voice, not the words, just the tone, measured, clear, not collapsing. I called Paulette. It's done, she said. He's been served. His attorney is already on the phone with the DA's office. Raymond turned himself in at noon. Turned himself in, I repeated. His attorney advised him. He's cooperating for now. It doesn't change the exposure. I thanked her and hung up. Adrienne was looking at me from across the room. It's really happening, she said. It's really happening, I said. My phone buzzed. An unknown number. I answered it. Diana. My father's voice. More quiet than I had ever heard it. Stripped of its usual texture, the way a room sounds when all the furniture has been removed. Dad, I said. I need you to understand something, he said. Okay, I said. I know what you think you did, he said. I know you think this was right. I need you to know that everything I built, everything, I built for this family. For you. I sat with that for a moment. You stole from your mother, I said. Your own mother, Dad. The silence that followed was the longest I have ever experienced. I know, he said finally. It was the only honest thing he said to me for a very long time. 2 weeks after Raymond Calloway slapped his daughter in his backyard at his birthday party, a judge in a civil courtroom signed a series of orders that changed the shape of his world. The hearing was not a criminal trial. That process would take much longer. This was a civil emergency injunction hearing, sought by Paulette Okafor on behalf of Bernice and 7 other current or former property owners in the Meridian Street corridor, combined with an action by the State Environmental Agency. The DA's criminal case was proceeding on a parallel track, but this civil hearing was the first public reckoning, and it moved with the speed of a case where the evidence was overwhelming and one of the primary witnesses had already been cooperating for 2 weeks. Lawrence Weston testified first. He was a compact, unhappy-looking man in his early 60s who spoke in the deliberate, careful way of someone who has rehearsed a difficult truth many times until he could say it without falling apart. He described the arrangement with Raymond Calloway. He described the Greenway payment structure. He described the falsified assessments, not just Meridian Street, but 3 prior sites over 11 years. He described the phone call in which Raymond had explicitly told him that a clean report was non-negotiable for the construction permit approval. He described the moment he decided to go to the DA's office. He said it quietly. I drove past the Meridian Street lot, and I thought about who was going to live there. I couldn't. He paused. I couldn't keep doing it. Raymond Calloway sat at the respondent's table in a gray suit that looked like it had been pressed very recently, which struck me as the saddest detail of the whole morning, that in the hours before this hearing, someone had pressed his suit. He sat with his attorney and he did not look at the witness stand, and he did not look at me, where I sat behind Paulette in the gallery. He did look once at my mother. She was seated 2 rows behind me with Adrian. When he turned and found her face, she held his gaze for a long moment, and then she looked away. Not with anger. With a finality that was harder to watch than anger would have been. Paulette presented the documents. The Weston note, the Greenway payment records, Adrienne's forensic analysis of the second accounting ledger, the Gerald Moss package, my grandmother's original investment records. She presented testimony from a state environmental scientist about the nature and extent of soil contamination at the Meridian Street site. Perchloroethylene levels well above safe thresholds at a depth that would have affected any structure's foundation and any groundwater in the surrounding area. She presented testimony from a physician about the health effects of long-term perchloroethylene exposure. The words carcinogen and developmental harm and elevated risk sat in the courtroom air like something with weight. Bernice, 72 years old, testified about her family's barbershop. She testified about the offer she'd received to sell. She testified about what her family had built on that block over 40 years. She was not a dramatic witness. She spoke in complete sentences and looked at the judge and said plainly what had happened to her and what she feared would have happened to people who moved into those units. When she was finished, the courtroom was quiet in the way that a space goes quiet when something true has been said in it. Raymond's attorney argued procedural objections and questioned the admissibility of several documents. The judge, a woman in her late 50s named the Honorable Patricia Osei, who had the reputation in Paulette's circles of being constitutionally immune to legal theater, heard each objection and ruled on each one with the efficiency of someone who had read every document in the case file the night before and had made up her mind about the facts before breakfast. The hearing lasted 4 hours. Judge Osei's orders, when they came, were comprehensive. Construction on the Meridian Street project was permanently enjoined pending full environmental remediation at Calloway Holdings' expense. All Calloway Holdings assets were frozen pending further proceedings. The company's operating licenses were suspended. A receiver was appointed to manage the company's existing obligations, the tenants in current Calloway properties, the existing contractual relationships, during the legal process. The orders addressed the Gerald Moss documentation as evidence of a pattern of fraud extending back to the company's earliest days. They ordered a full forensic audit of Calloway Holdings' financial history. They awarded emergency relief to Bernice and the other affected property owners. The judge said, in the measured, deliberate cadence of someone who has learned to carry precision like a tool, "The record in this case reflects a pattern of conduct in which financial gain was systematically prioritized over the safety and well-being of community members. The court takes seriously its obligation to ensure that when such patterns are established, the consequences are proportionate to the harm." Raymond Calloway did not make any visible reaction. He sat still. His attorney leaned over and said something. He nodded slightly. I sat in the gallery and watched my father become a smaller version of himself in real time. Not with satisfaction. Not with the vindication I had expected to feel. With something quieter and more complicated, a grief that had been waiting for years and had finally found a room to sit in. After the hearing, outside on the courthouse steps in the thin winter light, Bernice came and found me. She was a small, solid woman in a burgundy coat, and she held my hand in both of hers and looked at me with an expression I can only describe as seeing. "Thank you," she said. "I'm sorry it took this long," I said. "I'm sorry for what my father—" "Don't do that," she said gently. "You didn't do what he did. You did the opposite." She squeezed my hand once and let it go. "The opposite matters." I stood on the courthouse steps for a while after she left, watching the city move around me, ordinary and indifferent and ongoing. Adrian appeared beside me and handed me a coffee she'd gotten from somewhere. "What happens now?" she said. "The DA's case continues," I said. "The forensic audit. The civil suits from the other sites. The remediation process." I held the coffee and let it warm my hands. Years of untangling. "And your dad?" I watched a taxi pull up to the courthouse, and my father emerge from the building behind us with his attorney, moving toward it. He was moving quickly, his head down. He did not look for me. "He'll be fighting it for a long time," I said. "Some of it he might survive legally. Some of it he won't. And you?" I thought about the cake I had made at 5:30 in the morning. The 3 layers. The coconut pecan frosting. the careful cursive. I'm working on that, I said.